How does America's landscape tell the story of slavery? Clint Smith will be here to talk about his best-selling book, How the Word is Passed. What does a single crime in Denver tell us about gangs, rehabilitation, policing, and the transformation of a Black neighborhood in an American city? Julian Rubinstein will be here to talk about his book, The Holly. Elizabeth Harris joins us with news from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's June 25th. I'm Pamela Paul. Clint Smith joins us now. He is a writer for The Atlantic and the author of a new book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Clint, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with just a happy bit of news. Your book debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction. Just tell us about the moment you found that out.
Oh, man, this was never something that I could have even imagined. I mean, it was not on the radar for a book that is exploring the memory and landscape of historiography of slavery to end up, above Oprah and Bill O'Reilly. It was really amazing.
There's a pairing.
Yeah. My editor and my agent told me to be by my phone around 5 o'clock, which is when I think they get word of the list. And so 5 o'clock came and I didn't hear anything. 5:05 came. I didn't hear anything. 5:10 came. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't make the list. It's all right. Like, success isn't defined by external factors. I'll be okay. 5:15 came, still nothing. And I was like, I guess they're trying to figure out how to tell me that I didn't make the list. And then like 5:17 came and they called and both of them were just screaming. It was just like screaming and saying, like, number one, you debuted at #1. And I just fell out of my chair. I mean, it was amazing. I'm just so blown away by the support that readers have given this book, the way people have shared it and recommended it. It means the world. So I'm still sort of pinching myself. The whole thing is just wildly surreal, and I still can't believe it really happened.
You've been working on it for a while. How did the idea for the book originate?
Yeah, so I've been working on it for about 4 years. It started in May of 2017 when I was watching several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans. So I was watching the statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, among some others, be taken down. And I was watching these statues come down from my home here in Maryland and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what were the implications of that? What did that mean? What did it mean that in order to get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway? To get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard. That my middle school was named after a Confederate leader, that the street my parents live on still to this day is named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people. And it matters because symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They are reflective of stories that people tell, and those stories shape the narratives that societies carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which isn't to say that taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee is going to erase the racial wealth gap, but it is to say that it's part of a sort of larger ecosystem of stories and ideas that shape how we understand what has happened to communities and what communities need or deserve. And so I was thinking about that in New Orleans and then kind of expanded that exploration out into the broader United States and even across the ocean to try to understand like how different places reckon with or failed to reckon with their own relationship to the history of slavery.
Do you remember at what age you became aware of the fact that these roads and landmarks were named after Confederate leaders and what you felt at that time?
It's hard to say exactly when I knew specifically. I mean, I knew that they were part of something called the Confederacy, but so much of the language and so many of the stories that I had received around the Confederacy, or Robert E. Lee in particular, were centered around states' rights, and they were centered around people who were just fighting to protect their families and their communities and protecting themselves against a war of northern aggression.
Because that's the way it was taught to you in school.
Yeah, and I don't want to misrepresent it completely. I mean, in many ways it was taught to me in that way, but in many ways there was kind of just a silence around it. Part of, I think, the insidiousness of the project and the success of the Lost Cause as an ideological project and a political project is that it is not meant to make it so that everyone believes what that the Confederacy was something good. It is meant to sort of muddy the waters and make things turn ideological statements, or rather turn empirical statements into ideological ones, right? So if I say the Confederacy was a treasonous territory that raised an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, in a lot of settings, that would be perceived as me sharing an ideological opinion or a political sensibility rather than something that's grounded in historical evidence, which it is. All you have to do is look at the declarations of Confederate secession to see what, like a state like Mississippi in 1861 says, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material good in the world. And so they were not vague about why they were seceding, but I was never taught about the declarations of Confederate secession. I was never taught about Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, where he says slavery is the cornerstone upon which this new nation will be built. I was never taught so many of these things that made clear what the Confederacy stood for. And so then I'm, in City Park in New Orleans and feeding the ducks under the literal shadow of a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard, who's the general in the Confederacy who ordered the first shot that opened the Civil War. And I don't know who he is. And it's not until my adulthood, I think, that I gained a more acute sense of the totality of what the Confederacy stood for and what it did, and also gained a better sense of the legacies of these men. It was mostly men who fought a war predicated on perpetuating the enslavement of my ancestors. So I think so much of this book was written as an attempt to fill the gaps that I experienced as a kid, and to make concrete and give language to some of the things that I might have known in the abstract, but didn't have the specific language with which to name or understand at the time.
I want to go back to how the experience of researching this book informed your own sense of that history. But first, let's give listeners an understanding of the scope of the project. How many places did you visit, and how much time did you spend with each on-location research?
Yeah, so I visited dozens of places over the course of the last 4 or 5 years or so, but I wrote about 8 of them in the book, 9 if you include the prologue. And part of what I wanted to do was to capture places that represented the entire spectrum of how slavery is memorialized in this country. So you have a place like Angola Prison. Angola Prison is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is a place that is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the majority of people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist, and rightfully so. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are held there are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced when they were children, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which have since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, and who are going and working in fields of what was once a plantation, picking crops for virtually no pay while someone watches over them with a gun over their shoulder. And so what are the ways that a history of white supremacy I'm exploring in a chapter like that, not only enact physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numb us to certain types of violences that in another global context would be wildly unacceptable. And what does it mean that that place doesn't at all address or reckon with its relationship to that history, and that in fact it has a gift shop where it sells shot glasses and coffee mugs and sweatshirts and baseball caps, and on the coffee mugs it has the silhouette of a watchtower and says Angola, a gated community, as if to belittle or make a mockery of the thousands of people who are still living there. So on one end of the spectrum, you have a place like Angola. On another end of the spectrum, you have a place like the Whitney Plantation, which is a plantation in Louisiana and is the only plantation in Louisiana and one of the only in the country that centers the lives of enslaved people, even though it is surrounded by a sort of constellation of plantations where people continue to hold weddings and formal ceremonies and take pictures in front of the homes of former enslavers and have bridal suites inside of former slave cabins. And the Whitney sort of fundamentally rejects that idea that a plantation should be anything other than a memorial to a site of intergenerational torture. And it does the work of, as I say in the book, being a hammer that is attempting to unbend 4 centuries of crooked nails. And so those are two different ends of the spectrum in how this country reckons with. And then I try to capture sort of everything else in between.
I mean, it sounds like your book in many ways is an attempt to argue against that very notion. We can't change that. I mean, that's what history does. That's what the study of history does, is re-examine things so that people understand them in a new light.
Absolutely. And I think part of what the book is also trying to do is give us a sense of our proximity, not only to the physical landscape and sort of scars embedded in the topography of the United States and the land upon which slavery happened, but also to give us a sense of our temporal proximity to this history. You know, we talk about slavery oftentimes, or I think about the way I was taught about slavery in elementary school, and I was made to feel like it was something that happened in the Jurassic period, right? That it was like the Flintstones and the dinosaurs and slavery. But this history wasn't that long ago. Slavery existed in this country for 250 years and only has not existed for 150. And so it's an institution that existed for 100 years longer than it hasn't. And then the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person. Not the granddaughter, not the great-great-granddaughter. She was the daughter of someone born into slavery. And this is someone who's alive in 2016. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when I think about my 4-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago was in fact not that long ago at all. And so the idea that this institution that in the scope of human history was only just yesterday would have no impact on what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is both morally and intellectually disingenuous. I mean, slavery shaped in profound ways what our contemporary political, economic, and social infrastructure look like. And I think until we fully recognize that collectively as a country, then we will continue to create public policy and continue to legislate in ways that don't account for or make amends for the immense and profound harm that has been done to millions of people across generations in this country.
So you're talking about landscape. You literally explored the landscape in this book. How did you choose the 8 or 9, depending on how you count them, locations after having visited a few dozen, as you said? And did you stop those visits in February 2020 because that's when you intended to stop them? Or was this one of those projects that the pandemic cut short?
I decided that I wanted places that represented the patchwork of experiences or the patchwork of memories that are sort of emblematic of the different ways that slavery is memorialized across this country. So, for example, I go to Monticello because I'm really fascinated by Jefferson as a sort of microcosm for the cognitive dissonance of this country and the contradictions of this country, in the sense that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It is not just one, it is not just the other, it is both. And similarly, Jefferson is someone who wrote in one document that all men are created equal and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. He wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children that he had by an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings. And so when I go to a place like Monticello, part of what I'm trying to explore is how an institution like that is honest about the totality of the legacy of one of our founding fathers. And when I'm writing about Monticello, I'm selecting Monticello, but part of so many of the themes embedded in that chapter are true for Mount Vernon, where George Washington lived, are true for Mount Pelier, where James Madison lived, right? And so I go to these a myriad of different places, and then all of those different visits inform how I write about a place that is informed by those other places or in conversation with those other places. And so this book is about 9 places, but I could have written about 10,009. I mean, there are places across this country, everywhere across this country, that have a relationship to the history of slavery. And so part of what I wanted to do was just capture what is a sort of quilt, if you will, of different places that, again, represent different ways that slavery is memorialized and remembered, or often failed to be memorialized.
You talked about two ends of the spectrum, and perhaps it gets even sort of worse on one end or better on the other. The Whitney plantation, where it sounds like they've taken a very different approach, more conscious approach to preserving this history. And then on the other end, Angola. How good a job, generally speaking, do you think America does in terms of preserving, presenting, contextualizing, reconstructing its own history of slavery? And has that approach changed over time?
Part of what I try to show in the book is it depends on where you are. It depends on where you are, what community you're part of, what the political and historical sensibilities of that community are. So it is inconsistent, is kind of the conclusion, right? The way we memorialize slavery is profoundly inconsistent and depends on a variety of factors. I will say it is better than it has been. I mean, what a lot of people don't know is that until the mid 20th century, basically until the civil rights movement, the predominant narrative around slavery in the country was one that was propagated by historians like Ulrich B. Phillips, who said that slavery was a civilizing institution. That, in the words of the late South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, who was at one point our vice president, that slavery was a positive good for both Black and white people alike, that it saved them from the savagery of Africa, as he put it. So clearly, we are in a better place than we were then. And thanks to historians like Kenneth Stamp, who sort of led the way of historians reorienting our understanding of slavery in the mid 20th century so that we more effectively understand it as the origin point of the Black and white inequality that we see today, we have a more sophisticated and more acute understanding of the way that slavery shaped our country. But again, it's very inconsistent. And I think I saw that when I went to Monticello. When I was at Monticello, I interviewed two women named Donna and Grace, and that we had gone on this Slavery at Monticello tour, led by a guy named David Thorson. And that this tour at Monticello specifically, there's several tours at Monticello, and one of them focuses specifically on Jefferson's relationship to slavery and the lives of the enslaved people who lived there. And when I spoke to Donna and Grace after this tour, I wanted to go up to them because clearly they had been unsettled by so much of what they were hearing. And I went up and had a conversation with them, and they said, I had no idea that Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea that Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are folks who bought plane tickets, who rented hotel rooms, who rented cars, who came to this home, to Jefferson's home, as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, and had no conception of it as a place that was the home of hundreds of enslaved people, a place where the person they came to see and to pay tribute to was the enslaver to to families, multiple families across generations. And so I think that that's a microcosm of how there are still so many people who know very little about this country's relationship to the history of slavery and do not understand it in any way that is commensurate with the impact that it has had on our country. And so I think we're in a better place than we've been, but we still have a long, long way to go to achieve a sort of collective understanding of what this institution was and how it has impacted our society today.
So if we were to try to achieve that goal of creating a respectful, historically accurate, and appropriately contextualized historical presentation of slavery in this country, what do you think the guiding principles should be?
I think what we have to do, which is what many institutions across the country are doing, whether they're higher ed institutions, religious institutions, is simply be honest about what slavery did to this country, how it shaped the founding of this country, how it animated the political principles of this country, how it guided the social contract upon which this country was founded, and then be honest about its implications and its consequences. Because I think part of the problem is right now that with regard to slavery and with regard to Jim Crow and so much of what has happened over the course of 400 years in this country is that there is not an accounting for an appreciation for the way that history has shaped what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like, which is to say, I think all the time about this James Baldwin essay. I think it's a 1963 speech he gave to a group of New York City educators, became a 1964, I think, essay that was published called A Talk to Teachers. And in it, he says, he's Baldwin, he says a lot of brilliant things, but one of the things that he says is that Black children are told over and over and over again by this world that they are criminal. But the role of the teacher, and he's saying teacher here literally, but also as a sort of metonym for the larger society, he's saying the role of the teacher is to help that Black child understand that even though the world tells them over and over again that they are criminal, it is in fact the society and the history that created the conditions that that child is forced to grow up in that is actually the criminal. And for many of us, that's like very intuitive. That's a straightforward sociological framework. But I think we can not fully appreciate the extent to which so many people in this country are navigating their everyday lives without that as being the sort of guiding framework. And so what happens when you don't understand the way that history has shaped what our modern society looks like is that you look and see how one community looks one way, another community looks another way, and you believe it to be because of the people in those communities or what the people in those communities have or have not done, rather than being the manifestation of things that have been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And that is important because it makes it so that we do not fall into the trap of blaming people for the circumstances or social or economic conditions that they find themselves in, but rather we recognize it as being part of that this is the intergenerational result of a series of decisions, public policy decisions, and state-sanctioned decisions that have been made over time. And so I think any full account of slavery has to account for the way that, going back to what we were saying at the beginning, that this wasn't that long ago, and that there are people who are alive today who loved, who were in community with, who had relationships with people who were born into intergenerational chattel slavery, and that reality and that proximity and the way that it shapes everything we see in this country today is necessary for everyone to understand so that we can more effectively figure out how to make amends for the harm that it caused over hundreds of years and the remnants, as the scholar Saidiya Hartman talks about, how the afterlife of slavery continues to shape and animate our social, political, and economic lives today.
So not so long ago, and also not so far away, I was tempted to ask you about some of the more far-flung places like Blandford Cemetery and Goree Island, at least for me, far-flung. But let's end by talking about one of those places, New York, since we are currently recording this from New York. How is the history of slavery currently presented in New York, and how visible is it to visitors and also to the people who live here?
Part of why I wanted to include New York is because I wanted to make clear to the reader that slavery was not something that only happened in the South, which I think is a misunderstanding that a lot of people carry based on their sort of inadequate educations around the history of slavery. They think the North was, and specifically a place like New York, was always this sort of bastion of cosmopolitanism and abolition, and that they were, as the sort of subtitle of the chapter says, we were the good guys.
New York was especially bad.
Yeah, but New York was in actuality the second largest slave port in the country after Charleston, South Carolina, for an extended period of time. There were tens of thousands of enslaved people held in New York, and then New York was also the financial capital of this country that allowed for the plantations in the South and the cotton industry and so much of the enslavement below the Mason-Dixon line to sustain itself because of the financial backing of these New York City-based banks. And not only that, I mean, in 1860, after the election of Abraham Lincoln and on the eve of secession, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, actually proposed that New York City secede from the Union alongside South Carolina and some of these other states in the South because of New York's deeply entangled both political and economic relationship to the system and institution of slavery and the crops and goods that it produced. And so New York's history is one that is deeply entangled in the history of slavery. And I think that it's essential for us to recognize that, whether it be New York or Boston or Rhode Island or Connecticut, like that these places, these cities and states had their own deeply entangled relationships to slavery in ways that sometimes look different than the way that they looked in the South, but need to be accounted for nonetheless.
I do need to sneak in one last question. I can't help but ask you this on a literary podcast, but your previous book was a poetry collection, Counting Descent. And I wanted to know how different it was writing a book of nonfiction like this compared with writing a book of poetry, and how your work as a poet did or maybe didn't inform your writing in general and your writing of this book.
My work as a poet animates everything that I do. I mean, I'm a sort of strange mix of things in the sense that my first book was a collection of poetry. I sort of came up as a writer in the slam poetry scene in North Carolina, where I was in college, and in Washington, D.C., where I was a high school English teacher. But then went to graduate school and was trained largely by sociologists and political philosophers. And so I've always been interested in writing across genre, across mediums, different forms, different disciplines, different ways of thinking. And I think the writers and thinkers I've long admired have never been ones who have been constrained by specific disciplines or genres. And I think you use whichever genre is best to answer the questions that you're wrestling with most effectively. And so part of what poetry has done that I think very much shows up in this book is that it really has trained me to focus on the granular, to really sort of obsess over the most minute of detail, to not only, to think about, if you pass a tree every day, to like hone in on the specific physical details of that tree. Like what does the leaf look like? How many different shades of green do you see on the leaf? How is the stem, the texture of the stem different from the texture of the leaf itself? Is it brown in one place and yellow in another place? All to say, I think poetry teaches me to pay attention. And part of what I try to do is pay attention to the people and the places in this book to bring the best of the historiography I've spent the last several years with, the historiography around slavery from scholars who've written incredible books, like Annette Gordon-Reed and Dinah Ramey Berry and Leslie Harris and Walter Johnson and Ira Berlin and Kevin Levin and so many others whose books have been so formative and transformative for me, to bring the best of that and put it in conversation with the sort of sensory details and experience of the land. Because I think it's one thing to read about a slave cabin, and it's another thing to stand inside of one and to hear and feel the way the wood moans under your feet and the way that sunlight sort of sneaks in through the cracks of the wood panels of what truly used to be the home to enslaved people. It's one thing to read about a plantation, and it's another thing to walk across the land that enslaved people cultivated and built lives and communities and homes on. And so I wanted to bring as much sensory detail as possible and sort of emotional and human texture and put it in conversation with this incredible scholarship from these remarkable historians and try to create a sort of history book that felt almost novelistic, that felt like the reader was on the journey with me.
Well, I think this is certainly a book that tells readers to pay attention. The book again, and I can call it now an instant #1 New York Times bestseller, is How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith. Clint, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tina Jordan joins us now with our weekly celebration of the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hi, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I want to talk a little bit about bylines, which didn't become a requirement at the book review until 1924, and which, in all fairness, bylines weren't a regular thing in any publication. The Times and the book review were not exceptions. But I think looking back at early book review history, it's clear that a lot of unnamed critics took the kinds of pot shots at writers and poets and playwrights that they might not have otherwise taken if they'd had to sign their name.
It's very freeing. I have to say, I wrote a column for The Economist and used to review for them before anywhere else. And you can say what you like.
That's true, right?
Right.
And apparently the book review was a little bit feared, and people used to write letters to Adolf Ox, saying, help me, like my book is coming out. Can you promise me a good review? All these letters, of course, are in the Times archive at the New York Public Library. And in all the replies to these people, he's like, sorry, I can't help you, which was actually kind of nice to see.
Same deal holds today.
Same deal holds. Anyway, I was just going to read you a few one-liners from some of those early reviews. Pamela, you and I have discussed some of these early negative reviews, and we think of them as we were wrong, sort of like the books we weighed in on very early on that we just completely missed. Here's Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. It is a book one can very well get along without reading.
Signed anonymous.
Signed anonymous, right? Collected poem of William Butler Yeats, who would, of course, go on to win the Nobel in 1923. In 1896, Anonymous wrote that the volume was, quote, as discouraging as a breakfast of cold porridge. Ouch. Thomas Mann Buddenbrooks.
What? We gave a negative review to Buddenbrooks?
This is right before the byline law went into effect. We called it immature, and the critics said, one has a suspicion that Mann likes death scenes.
Okay, well, that's fine, and I think is a point in his favor.
Right.
And he was only 25 when he wrote it, but let's just say I disagree.
I kind of disagree with that, too. And then there would be the books that reviewers just sometimes didn't know what to do with. This was actually a signed review of Ulysses by Dr. Joseph Collins, who called James Joyce's masterwork, quote, the most important contribution perhaps that has been made to fictional literature. But then he went on to say, but the average reader will glean little or nothing from it, even from careful perusal. One might properly say study of it, save bewilderment and a sense of disgust. So it sometimes went both ways. Anyway, it is a lot of fun to go back and look at some of these early negative reviews. I have to tell you, I almost cried over the Anne of Green Gable one because we call Anne Shirley, a humorless little waif, which I also don't agree with, Pamela.
Well, we can't blame anyone because it was anonymous.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, Tina.
All right. Thanks, Pamela.
Julian Rubinstein joins us now from Denver. His new book is called The Holly: 5 Bullets, 1 Gun, and the Struggle to Save an American Neighborhood. Julian, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Let's start with the title. I don't think many non-Denverites are familiar with the Holly. What is this neighborhood?
This is a neighborhood that has a really amazing history in the city that even isn't as well known within Denver as it should be. It's actually the center of the city's civil rights movement, where a 1968 police shooting was what tipped over the frustration and anger at the time, a few months after MLK's death and just after RFK was assassinated. It had become the gathering spot for youth in Northeast Denver, where most of Denver's African Americans lived. And that shooting led to protests, demands, and a summer of really unrest. It also then, through the years, it became a place of really, I guess, tragedy and transformation over the years. It had then fallen in the 70s to some of the social ills that we see in other similar neighborhoods, from poverty, unemployment, drugs, ultimately violence, and gangs. And the Holly Shopping Center, which was the gathering place at the center of the neighborhood, became the first headquarters of Denver's first Bloods gang.
And when was this?
That was around 1987. And soon after that, the main character in the book, Terrence Roberts, who was a third-generation resident of this neighborhood, became a Bloods gang member.
You grew up in Denver. What was your recollection of the Holly? Were you familiar with it? And how has it changed since that time?
So when I grew up there, I had very little knowledge of the Holly. There's a couple things I remembered. One was that it was the place past which you had to drive to get to the airport. It was very close to the old airport, which was then Stapleton International Airport. And I had just some ideas from, I guess, some media reporting about that it was well known as this kind of place that was like violent or had drugs. And that was something that I guess I took in just in terms of like a place to stay away from. And I had never been there until 2013, I read a story in the New York Times. I was then living in Brooklyn and read this story about a shooting that took place there that totally intrigued me because it involved this main character, Terrence Roberts, who was a former gang leader who had turned his life around after about 10 years in prison and had become an anti-gang activist. And at his own peace rally, had shot someone right in Holly Square, which at the time was undergoing a very significant high-profile redevelopment project. I had been, a journalist my whole career. I'd left Denver after high school. I still had friends and family there. And I thought this intrigued me enough, at least, to go back and try to look into what had happened and what was going on there.
So in 2013, you read this story in the New York Times. You're living in Brooklyn, as you said. You decide to fly back to Denver to find out what happened. What was your ambition at that time? Are you thinking, I'm going to write a magazine article or a newspaper article about this story? Or did you go into it thinking, now's the time for me to write a book about Denver in some way?
Definitely was not sure at first. As you may remember, I can't believe it, but it's 17 years since my first book came out. I'm almost embarrassed to say, but it's partly because, books are very hard. They're a lot of work, and I have a really high bar. I thought that there was a lot of very interesting things that presented themselves at first when I got into it. I mean, I definitely didn't make any determination for at least a few months. I had made a couple or 3 reporting trips to Denver before I did decide to do a book proposal. And actually, I had some contact with my editor at the New Yorker. I was back and forth with him a few times. And once I realized how much grist was behind all of this, I just thought, God, even in a long magazine story, I don't think I could get in what I want to do here. So it was that point that I did decide to do a book proposal.
I want to talk about that grist because there are so many gun-related crimes that take place every day in this country. All of them, I'm sure, with their own interesting background and complexities. What is the grist in this particular crime? Why is this crime worthy of this kind of book-length attention?
A lot of things for me stood out. I would say, for one, Terrence as a character was so complex and also symbolic of so many things. He, had not only been a third-generation resident who'd grown up right around Holly Square, spent much of his life there, except for the time he'd spent in prison. And when he'd gone back there, he, like many, decided that he wanted to help try to turn this neighborhood around. And it was right at a time when urban development, redevelopment, gentrification, all kinds of different ways that are presented as describing what might happen was really going on. And I thought that that would be a way into seeing what's really going on the ground in a neighborhood that we don't normally hear that much about. And then the other factor I would say for sure that stood out to me was that as I started reporting it, things that were in the public domain to that point weren't really matching up necessarily with my reporting. And I thought, what's behind that? So I thought if I can really get to the real side of this neighborhood, it would be worth doing.
You're a white guy coming from Brooklyn, New Yorker writer, and you approach Terrence Roberts wanting to talk to him. How open was he to discussing all of this with you? And did you have to work to gain his trust?
At first, he was actually, in general, I would say at first and later, he was relatively open. At the time that I met him, he was facing a long prison sentence and he was out on bond awaiting trial or the outcome of his case. Sometimes people in those situations, and Terrence was one of them, are open to talking to someone who would listen to them because they want to maybe get their story out. What I didn't realize at first was that he was unwilling to speak to the Denver media. Interestingly, he had for a little while been a sort of a darling of the Denver media. And then, and this is one thing I found, that what was going on in Holly Square was that there was a real constellation of powers that were part of the redevelopment and part of the federal anti-gang effort going on there. And so you're talking about powerful people, including billionaire Philip Anschutz, the most powerful and wealthy nonprofits in Denver, the city of Denver itself. And Terrence felt at first, and I did later agree, that the fix was in on him. Like before this shooting happened, one thing that was quite interesting was that a lot of very powerful people over there wanted him out for various reasons that included that he didn't agree with the way things were being handled over there. And so, he did have I guess, an interest in speaking to me. So I kept speaking to him. And then, of course, I had to, move on and find many other people, some of whom didn't want to speak to me at first. But ultimately, I kept sticking around and going to places and showing that I not only cared, but was starting to understand what was going on. And once it got to that point, then it was actually really interesting how people did start wanting to talk to me. And when shootings and things would happen, they were texting me, not only almost to tell me, but I got the sense that they were putting it on me, like, we're counting on you. It's your obligation now to kind of get this out, because the full story of what was going on over there was definitely not being told.
In her review of the book, Marcia Chatelain in the book review said, it's unambiguous that Terrence Roberts shot Hassan Jones. That much we know. The question is, which Terrence Roberts? So you've mentioned that he was a Bloods gang member turned peace activist. He used to be known as Showbiz in this former lifetime of his. Tell us a little bit about Terrence, what his childhood was like, how he became a Bloods gang member, what brought him to convert, change his mind, and then work to help facilitate peace between gang members.
Terrence is sort of also a classic example of many of the youth that ultimately get involved in gangs. He had been an honors student in middle school, and right at the time when the Bloods had started to appear there, and also on the other side of, not quite the other side of town, but across Colorado Boulevard on the other side of Northeast Denver, the Crips had appeared, and the Crips were starting to attack them first. They had been there first, they were bigger, and Terrence, like many others in the neighborhood, the original way that he wanted to get involved in gangs actually was to be a defender of the hood. The people there in the community, Terrence and others were telling me, they felt invisible. They felt they were lost, forgotten, the people who were not part of anything else going on. So they formed their own thing. They formed their own families. And Terrence became actually, sure enough, one of the leaders of the Bloods at the time. And, in terms of the question of who shut up that day, it's actually a very interesting one. And that was actually what came out at trial as well, the question of who showed up on the day of this peace rally. And I did also discover evidence that the Bloods had a plan for Terrence that day. He didn't just shoot this guy out of nowhere. But there's a line in the book that I always think is, one of my favorite lines in the story. And it's from his father, who has had his own dramatic transformation. And he told me that when because Terrence was basically beefing, so to speak, with these Bloods over, of all things, whose courts these were at Holly Square. And he was really trying to actually win the Bloods over to his independent effort called the Colorado Camo Movement, which definitely was a peace effort. And what happened was the Bloods also, were fighting over, in fact, Hassan Jones. It became like a bellwether, who was a guy whose father Terrence grew up with, who was a legendary Blood. And on the day of this thing, as Terrence's father says, by Terrence having these kind of altercations with the Bloods over this question, he opened up Pandora's box. And then when he opened up Pandora's box, Showbiz came out. And that Showbiz was the one that showed up in that moment. In the book, this is a book of a lot of gray areas and a lot of people who aren't who they say they are. But my feeling was that, and actually I believe everyone's feeling that I could find, was that Terrence absolutely was trying to do the right thing. In terms of the moment itself, that is the reason it went to a jury. And, the jury decided that Terrence was within his right to defend his life on that day.
We're at a time where we are paying a lot of attention to the way that law enforcement handles issues, particularly in predominantly Black neighborhoods, of which the Holly certainly is one. You wrote a few interesting things. You said that a lot of community-based and faith-based efforts were actually funded by and significantly run by law enforcement. How did that come to pass, and how did you figure that out? What's going on there?
It's actually one of the most important things I feel that needs to happen. As we speak, Joe Biden's got, I think, pledged $5 billion to so-called community-based violence prevention programs. What I feel about that is that it really needs to be given to independent efforts and true independent efforts. This has been something that's played out historically. And the book, as you know, is it's a multi-generational story. And in many ways, I think it's a story of activism and thwarted activism over the decades, and including the connections between gangs and activism, which goes all the way back to the civil rights movement. But in this case, what has gone on is that in communities where there's gang violence, there's the Project Safe Neighborhoods effort, which is a federal program, the premier anti-gun and anti-gang program. And they have significant funding that's given to cities to do this. And around the effort, cities, along with that, supplement and raise money to match it. But these programs are under the umbrella of a law enforcement effort. And so law enforcement has a lot of sway over how they're run. And the problem is that, of course, the goals that law enforcement has may be different than a social services program that's independent. In Denver, for example, between 2010 and 2019, $16 million flowed into the city from the CDC to study gang violence and from the DOJ to fight gang violence. And during that time, starting when Denver's gang violence was at an all-time low, thanks at least in part to the independent effort that Terrence Roberts had going, it went up every year since then, sometimes significantly. It's basically going straight up. And so the problem that law enforcement has in many ways is they want people who are going to work with them, for example. And unfortunately, what's happening is even to the level of things like most people have at least some understanding of what went on with Whitey Bulger, the Irish mafia boss in Boston, who for some 20 plus years was an FBI informant while working still as a mafia boss and murdering people. Maybe the law enforcement saw it as something that worked for them because he could give information, and they kind of looked the other way on whatever he was doing. Well, the same thing is going on here in these communities where we don't know much about it. And the violence continues to go up, and a lot of these crimes are unsolved. And in Denver and elsewhere, law enforcement is using active gang members as anti-gang activists. And this is in the social services side of this sort of program that works alongside these more undercover efforts. And the results have been really disastrous. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
All right, there is obviously a lot more to this and a lot more in the book. I will leave it for readers to discover. The book, again, is called The Holly, 5 Bullets, 1 Gun, and the Struggle to Save an American Neighborhood by Julian Rubinstein. Julian, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Elizabeth Harris joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So there's a lot of questions about sort of what's going to happen next in the world of books. For the last year, there was a huge surge from books about Trump. There was the Mary Trump book, Too Much and Never Enough. People were buying these books like crazy. And now Trump is gone, and no one is expecting books about Biden to sell as well. So there's a question mark about the political books as well. I mean, what happens next now that cash cow is gone?
I mean, one interesting thing is that there are 2 new books coming out about Trump next month that are kind of competing against each other and both covering the last year in office. One by Michael Wolff, whose book Fire and Fury set off the mega sales of Trump books. It'll be interesting to compare how that does versus how that first book did.
Now that the daily outrage is gone, do people just want to kind of tune it out and not think about him? A lot of the people who kind of hate bought those books. Or are people going to be, still really interested because he's still a figure in the Republican Party? So that'll be interesting to see. What's the other one?
And the other book is by 2 Washington Post reporters, Philip Rucker and Carol Leonig.
Usually books by the opposition party do really well during presidential administration. Like books attacking Bill Clinton did really well when Bill Clinton was in office, and books attacking Obama did well, and books attacking Trump did well. But Biden is kind of boring. It's one of his superpowers, right? So like a book attacking Biden, like just there isn't, people don't really see that as moving copies in the same way.
I guess it's kind of surprising that books haven't come out attacking Kamala Harris or, again, like who's going to attack Jill Biden? It seems somewhat unlikely.
Yeah, I'm sure someone will, but it just doesn't seem like that many people are going to be interested in buying it. But I guess we'll see. But there are books from former Trump officials that are getting bought. You know, Kellyanne Conway is at Simon & Schuster. Mike Pence is at Simon & Schuster. Jared Kushner is at HarperCollins. But another interesting thing that's happening with political books is that it's been harder for some administration officials to get books. I mean, usually at the end of a presidential term, lots of people get lots of books, and it's just sort of run of the mill. But this year it's been harder because there's a lot of opposition from within, like the staff of publishing houses and their authors. There's a lot of anti-Trump sentiment. And so people are a little concerned about there's a risk benefit of, do you want to sign these people and really anger your staff who think of this as sort of morally unacceptable to publish these people? But on the other side, you want to publish a range of voices, and these people, were in a presidential administration. It's been much more complicated this year. And recently, a new publishing house that's branding itself as a conservative player that really wants these books just launched. And it is called All Seasons, and it's run by two women who each ran conservative imprints at big publishers. And one of their first books is going to be by Mark Meadows, who was Donald Trump's former chief of staff. So it'll be interesting to see what they pick.
How are book sales doing generally?
So last year's book sales were great. Everyone was stuck at home. There wasn't a lot of competition for entertainment. So the presumption was this year, as things opened up, there would be, fewer people would buy books. But it's not really clear how much things are going to drop, was sort of the question. I mean, after Harry Potter, the huge, huge surge in sales from Harry Potter, there was sort of a Harry Potter effect where some people who picked up the habit of reading stuck with it and kept buying books. Will that happen here? Will some people keep the habit, or will it all just go right back to what it was before? And so far, sales seem to be sticking. NPD BookScan, which tracks the sales of most print books in the country, says that 60 million more books were sold in the first 5 months of this year than the same period the year before. But even comparing this year to 2019, which was like a normal year, the volume is still way up. It's about 60 million more books than were sold then. So far, it's hanging on. And, we'll see as sort of moving into the summer and things like that. And as, everyone kind of gets back to their lives. But BookScan is now expecting the business to have a good year, which they were not necessarily anticipating, in January when the year began.
How about you, Liz? Are you going to read political books? What are you reading?
Oh, I'm not. I'm taking a break. I'm going to be honest. So I'm one of those. What am I reading? God, I'm just finished. What did I just finish? I just finished The Vixen by Francine Prose, which we have a profile of her coming out next week, which is a book about Ethel Rosenberg, the CIA, and it's hilarious. So that was a surprise to me.
Excellent. All right, Liz, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams. Hey there.
Hey, Pamela. Hi, Pamela.
Greg, let's start with you. What have you been reading?
Well, on and off, I've been reading this new biography of Sylvia Plath called Red Comet by Heather Clark, and that's not what I'm going to talk about here today. I mention it only to say that book sent me off to re-track down Elizabeth Hardwick's collected essays, because Hardwick is mentioned a couple of times in the Sylvia Plath biography. First in the preface, and then later when Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes moved to Boston and are living there at the same time as Elizabeth Hardwick and her husband, Robert Lowell. And I just had one of these things where my brain started thinking, it's this fascinating phenomenon of literary women married to, in kind of these tempestuous, tumultuous marriages to very strong personality male poet. And Robert Lowell was that, and Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath's husband, was that as well. And in a way that certainly during their lifetimes tended to overshadow the wives in those marriages. And I thought, I wonder what Elizabeth Hardwick had to say about Sylvia Plath. And I went to try to find an essay that she wrote about her for the New York Review of Books. And as it happens, that essay is collected in a Hardwick collection called Seduction and Betrayal that I don't own, but I do own the collected essays of Elizabeth Hardwick. And so I started dipping into that. So I don't have what she said about Plath, but I do have this amazing collection selected by Daryl Pinckney, published by the New York Review of Books, that really shows off Hardwick as kind of a journalist. Writing these, they're essays, but they are very wide-eyed, taking in her culture and her time. Our listeners may remember last year I read an essay collection by Flannery O'Connor and was struck at that time that Flannery O'Connor, who lived in Georgia and was writing during the time of the civil rights movement, really avoided writing about that at all. And there was some discussion of Flannery O'Connor's views on race and how she just didn't bring that into her writing. It seemed to take no interest in the civil rights movement. And Hardwick, who grew up in Kentucky before moving to New York and on to Boston, is just the opposite. She takes such interest in the civil rights movement. She goes down south. There's an essay in here about the protests in Selma, and she goes to Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral. She writes about the report after the Watts riots. And all of these essays, reading them today, it's interesting because there's so much linkage between what she's seeing at the time and what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter protests starting after George Floyd's death last year. And she writes with this kind of clear-eyed equanimity. It's very cool. She doesn't bring herself personally into there a lot, except as a consciousness. And she talks to people. She sets the scene in Selma, for instance, where she writes about that. She talks to white people reacting to the protests, and she's not sympathetic to their racist views, but she is sympathetic to their class plight, and she sees capitalism as a problem in itself. And they're very kind of carefully delineated snapshots of what's going on. That's what I'm reading, the collected essays of Elizabeth Hardwick. There's a lot more. I mean, it's not just race stuff by any means, but that's what has jumped out at me because of the overlaps with today. That's the stuff that I've responded to most strongly in this collection.
I think I have a copy of Seduction and Betrayal laying around somewhere, so if you want to hop on the phone after this recording session, maybe I can read you the Plath essay.
I found snippets of it here and there, and Heather Clark in her Plath biography quotes from that essay in the preface, partly to say that Hardwick's not fair to Plath, that she thought that Plath had no real social vision, and Heather Clark's biography says that she very much did. So, I've seen where Hardwick says that Plath's writing is like a punch to the face. Some great lines in there. And yet one feels that she liked Plath and liked Flannery O'Connor. So people that she sometimes disagreed with. Again, she writes with kind of tremendous generosity of spirit. John, what are you reading?
I recently went back and read a novel that was getting a lot of attention, what feels to me like last year, but it turns out that it was 3 years ago, which I guess is indicative of how we've all been living, which is a first novel called Early Work by a writer named Andrew Martin. It's really a book about writers, a young guy named Peter, who I think is in his late 20s when the book starts, who has a girlfriend of a few years, and he meets another woman named Leslie, who's also a writer, and the two of them start an affair. And she has, I think, a partner in another city they're having a long-distance relationship. There's a lot of talk about books and contemporary authors in it, but it's not really an inside baseball book. It's really about love and the different ways that people desire each other and the way those things fall apart, especially when you're of a certain age. There's a lot about this book on paper that would sound a little flat to me, but Martin is a very lively writer. And in fact, for the first third of the book or so, I almost didn't trust it because it was so lively. I thought, how is he doing this? This seems too, I don't know if it didn't seem glib, but I just thought there's something too entertaining about this. I was kind of flying through it. And I don't think that I took it seriously until it started to accumulate a bit more. And by the end of the book, I realized that not only is he an excellent writer, but I was kind of invested in these characters in a way that I wouldn't have predicted in the opening pages. And Molly Young, who is a great critic who reviewed the book for the book review, I kind of vaguely remembered her saying this, but I hadn't read the book yet. So I went back and looked at her review, and she says towards the end of it, it's a rave review, and she says, "If I'm doing a poor job of demonstrating that Peter is, in fact, an intensely compelling protagonist, that's because I have no clue how Martin pulls it off." And that, for me, goes for not just Peter, who is not likable, not that I care about that, but he's not even sort of flamboyantly unlikable, like a Martin Amis protagonist or something. He's a little schlubby, he's a writer, but he doesn't write that much or that well, apparently. But there is something that you latch onto eventually about the way that Martin writes him and his relationships. And I found the whole thing, I guess there's something a little bit depressing about it, because since the characters aren't very likable and you're invested in them, you're not rooting for anyone necessarily. You're just sort of seeing how sad all of these connections are, which doesn't get at some of the more positive aspects of the emotional relationships in the book. But I wondered sometimes if he was satirizing young writers or whether he was completely deeply communing with them. And I think it's the mix of those things that probably pulls off the book in the end. I don't sort of tear through all that many books, and I read this one very, very quickly over the course of a couple of nights.
I remember talking about this book back in real life in the office in that vague timeline that you're talking about where we don't know how many years ago it was, because I wanted to read it after reading Molly Young's review. And someone talked me out of it. I can't remember who. My question at the time was, am I going to hate this because it's all about millennials, or does it sort of, manage to get past that? I'm sorry, millennial listeners. I don't hate all millennials. I think I maybe just have issues with a resistance to millennial novels. But
Molly definitely sold it. But also,
but
you're right. That's an interesting sort of sub-conversation to have, because Molly's one of those critics who you read her and if she has enthusiasm for something, or even if she doesn't sometimes, she just makes you want to read whatever she's talking about.
She does.
Yeah, which is sort of why I eventually came to this book, I think, because I remembered how into it she was.
Pamela, did you go on to read this book? I ask because I have a copy of this book on my shelf, and it is your copy.
Oh my God, that's right. That's right. You know what? As you started to say, I have a copy of this book, I was thinking, I'm going to smugly say, I too have a copy.
You don't.
I don't. I gave you this and a Sally Rooney novel.
You did.
At
and
the same
I've read
time
the Sally
in
Rooney.
my sort of unloading of millennial works.
You gave me Conversations with Friends, which I have read and enjoyed. But Andrew Martin is still waiting for me. I haven't read it yet. Now with John's endorsement on top of Molly Young's, I may need to return to it.
Okay, wait. So here's the solution. John, you give that essay collection, the Hardwick, to Greg. Greg, you give me my book back, and all we need to figure out is what I need to give you, John.
I'm going to go and get on the train so you guys can finish up this segment. With that.
Pamela, what are you reading?
I recently read two books that I think both of you have read, or at least one of you has read each, and they're very different. And my feelings about them are different. The two books are The Copenhagen Trilogy by Tove Ditlevsen, and No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. We're going to not fight. We're going to have a civilized discussion here. First, I'll talk about The Copenhagen Trilogy. Which of you have read it?
I've read it. I love it.
It's very funny you mentioned that, because that's actually what I read the first volume last year, and I just started reading the second volume yesterday, and so that's what I'm currently reading.
Did you buy those little separate volumes they have?
No, this is where the sort of inside baseball happens. I have actually a galley from the UK that I asked for when I first read about it, because it was reviewed over there before it was published
because
here.
John is so far ahead of all of us.
I'm so far. I'm the sort of bellwether for for obscure European fiction.
I'm the anti-bellwether for obscure European fiction, because
This is not fiction.
No, it's not.
Fair,
it's
fair,
a memoir.
fair.
We should be clear. It's a memoir. The three
and a
parts,
harrowing one.
Yeah, the 3 parts in the trilogy are childhood, youth, and dependency. And I was actually going to say, unlike John, do not gravitate towards, writers from smaller European countries whose work from the, let's say 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s is suddenly being resurrected and published, usually by FSG or, New Directions or something. And I have an almost a knee-jerk, really silly and mulishly stupid reaction against reading those things when I hear about them. I'm like, oh, no. If I needed to read about that, like I would have read about it at the time, even though, of course, I wasn't alive. I had the same resistance. And I say mulish and stupid because in this case, the book is great. I had that same reaction with Magda Szabo's The Door.
Right. Just also
great. Which, of course, was excellent. So I should know by now that I should be more John-like and open-minded with these sort of lesser-known writers from Middle Europe who emerge. Tove is not from Middle Europe. She is from, as the title indicates, Denmark. And this is a really incredible memoir, or I should say 3 memoirs. I don't want to say too much about it. I really want listeners to get this book, discover it for themselves. She grows up working class in Stockholm, in the kind of pre-socialist Stockholm, the kind of pre-Nordic paradise world in which everyone has subsidized everything. And life is hard for her. And life is hard for her as a girl and as a woman. The prospects are fairly bleak. And she is an incredibly modern, very contemporary thinker and wants to live beyond the expectations for women of her time and her class and her sex. And in the third part of the book, it's not really giving anything away. It's there in the title, Dependency. She becomes addicted to drugs. And I love a good addiction story. And this is one of the best, which is not to say that it's fun. It's really, as Greg said earlier, harrowing. And to see the connections between the childhood, the youth, which is really about her sort of becoming a writer, and then dependency, which is about her descent into a really terrible drug addiction, to see how she develops over time into that person is really remarkable. And she's especially good, I thought, at writing through the lens of, through a child's eyes. You really don't feel like this is someone looking back. You feel like it's very diaristic in the moment, really granular.
That's true, although a very, very uncannily articulate child.
Yes. And the language is incredible. I'm sure it's in part due to the translation, which is by Tina Nunnally and Michael Favela Goldman.
Yeah, I was going to mention the translators because I'm sure that obviously in the original it's stunning too, but there's something so measured and kind of perfectly turned about the language in it. It's very simply told in a way. The writing is not ornate. It's very easy to read on some level, even when it's describing difficult things, but there's a kind of perfection to it.
Yes, it's that deceptively plain prose that is in fact very deliberate.
And very emotionally charged without really saying
psychologically as well, yeah.
Yeah. It reads kind of novelistically, which you said at another time, Pamela, when we were talking about it off air.
Yes.
Which is maybe why we initially had to have Greg correct us and say that it's a memoir.
Well, that's a good transition to No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, because this is a novel that reads very memoiristically,
yes.
Sort of the opposite. And it's a novel about which there was so much discussion and debate among editors on our desk and at the book review that I did feel very left out. I had to read it and form an opinion quickly. And it's hard not to have an opinion about this book. It's basically divided into 2 parts. It's very fragmented in terms of the sort of structure, if you can call it a structure, of the book, in that the first part is really these kind of dispatches, some connected and some very marginally connected and some disconnected, about life in the internet era. And on this, Patricia Lockwood is completely brilliant. You feel like you are in the mind or with the mind of a genius. And I don't say that lightly. She's a really original and interesting thinker and writer. She's very funny. It's like her synaptic connections are electrically attuned to the world around her. And she comes up with these incredible and unexpected metaphors for
she's a poet, it's worth saying, and she's a comic poet, and both of those things in the first half of this book, where it's all kind of like a Twitter thread, it just shine.
Yes. And then the second half, I think is a kind of deliberate contrast to that first half, in that if what she's saying about the internet is that, and life in the internet era is that we're all freely afloat and don't know what to think and are unsure of everything and kind of overwhelmed and connected and not connected and detached and attached and all these things. In the second half, she's saying, and this is real. This is the real part, which is life and death. In the second half, where her sister gives birth to a child who has a genetic anomaly that essentially means that this child is not going to live for long. I don't remember the term for it, but it's essentially what the person whose life is portrayed in the film The Elephant Man has, or elephantitis, it used to be called. It has a nicer name now, but it's, of course, not a nice condition to have and often life-threatening. And it's about what happens to this baby, and it's about Patricia Lockwood's relationship to this baby. And to my mind, at least, the two have seemed connected in terms of here's a contrast. But again, what I don't necessarily get is the sense that this is a cohesive novel, so much as it is a really interesting book of essays in which you kind of have these two different mirror halves. What did you guys think?
I actually think you perfectly described it, from its strengths to its lack of cohesion, and also its genesis does seem to be in Lockwood's observations about Twitter and her personal experience.
I read this book after John talked about it on the podcast because he liked it so much. And I'm a big Patricia Lockwood fan. I liked her earlier memoir, and I love her Twitter. And so a book based on her Twitter seemed like it would be just the thing. And I remember when John talked about this on the podcast, he said he was struggling. He said he loved it, but was struggling with whether he would recommend it to somebody who's not constantly on Twitter, because it felt so much a creature of that. I am somebody who's constantly on Twitter. I didn't have a problem with that part of it. And in fact, I mean, I really love both parts of the book for what they're each doing in their separate ways. Where I felt a little bit disappointed in it is the structure of it. I read a lot for architecture when I'm reading a novel, for how it's constructed. And here it felt a little bit cheap, like that divide between the Twitter stuff at the beginning, which is brilliant in its own right, and the sister and the child, which is brilliant and again, harrowing, to steal that word again, in its own right. Putting them together made the second part feel like a punchline or a gotcha, like a little too like she's standing on a soapbox to proclaim that the first part is all meaningless somehow.
I ended up continuing to struggle with that, and I think it's a brilliant book. But there's something about it that made the second half, which I know is grounded in reality, and so I don't mean this at all as a sort of, I mean this purely as literary criticism, trying to divorce it from the real world. I found the second half a little bit purpley and sentimental sometimes, in a way that jars with what I find to be her completely, gimlet-eyed is too soft a term for the way that she sees the world. And then to contrast that with some of the sentimentalism in the second half, that just didn't sit with me as a reader, just in terms of the tone of the experience, not necessarily judging it emotionally. I would still not recommend this, I don't think, to someone who isn't either very plugged in online or under a certain age. And I just think that's purely because it really is experientially simulating something that a lot of people probably just literally don't understand.
Unless you really didn't like them, John.
Right. Like if I wanted to make my mom's brain explode, I would hand her this book.
I could not imagine my parents reading this book.
But I love my mother, so I won't do that.
All right. Let's run down the titles again, John.
I read Early Work by Andrew Martin.
I read The Collected Essays of Elizabeth Hardwick.
And I read No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood and The Copenhagen Trilogy by Tove Ditlevsen. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.